Happy Tuesday, friends, and welcome to an update edition of Your Daily Detroit for April 30th, 2019. I'm Sven Gustafson.
And I'm Jer Stays, recording at the Podcast Detroit studios in Royal Oak. First, though, real quick, an apology. As you might have noticed, we missed our Monday show, and not for a lack of trying. And these are no excuses, and I'm very sorry that we did, but we've been working on a new segment for Detroit Public Television, moving the website actually to a new host, and launching a microsite for a client on the side. Like, this has been a crazy beginning of the week, Sven.
When you get to editing this, you need like a bed of like some very sad violin music there.
Agreed. But this gives us an opportunity to talk about something that people have come up and asked when they run into me in the street or, comments we get online, things like that. I think the reality is that I don't think we share with enough people. We are actually like a really tiny team.
Yes, we are. We are not some like venture-funded thing. We are bootstrapping this whole thing. I mean, the truth is, it's Jer and I, with a big assist from Cheyenne, who edits a lot of our audio. She fills in on the show. You hear her voice. You have a great radio voice, by the way, Cheyenne. We get help from some other friends, Randy Walker, Bob and Dave from Podcast Detroit, Nuri Gojai, our spirits advisor.
But like all these people, they're not on the payroll.
No, I mean, this is a very small operation, and we worked very hard at it. Why? Because we love telling stories. We love this crazy thing called podcasting. We're passionate about our city. We want to share what we know and what we think about it. Luckily, we got enough people who like to listen to what we have to say. And frankly, we're probably a little bit crazy.
Let's get into the stories.
Last week, we brought you the news that the HBO series Real Sports with Bryant Gumbel planned to air a segment taking a look at what's happened right here in our city with District Detroit. That's the name the Ilitch family gave to the 50 blocks it plans to redevelop between downtown Detroit and Midtown, anchored by the Little Caesars Arena. Well, now the episode has aired. Jer, I don't have HBO, but you saw it. What do you think?
First off, super depressing. Those of us who've been covering this for a long time know that this is the case. We often record this at the Podcast Detroit studios in the Detroit Shipping Company, but that studio actually is right on the border of District Detroit. We can see upon the expanse of nothingness and nothing that has happened in those spaces. And I'll just use this as an example. The building that we record in was completely built in the time since they announced this project. Mm-hmm. And those guys are a lot smaller. They actually, I don't think, took any taxpayer funding for their thing. Meanwhile, the Ilitches got, something like $324 million. Yeah. And that here's the thing about that. If it was their own money that they were spending, they're going to do what they do. But this is taxpayer money. And so in my mind, taxpayer money means that the thing should have a benefit to the city.
Well, you have a lot more responsibility and a lot more accountability, frankly, because you took public money.
Exactly. The thing is, to me, I actually think that Mayor Duggan has kind of abdicated his responsibility around this particular issue. I'm not here to slam everything he did, but on this one, I don't agree. One of his development chiefs stood by the Ilitches in a recent statement about about the development and hitting the numbers. But the thing is that government is one of the few checks against the power of the rich and powerful. Mm. And if our mayor isn't willing to step up and say, hey, yes, you did this development, but we need something that benefits residents. I mean, there's stuff happening 100 yards away at City Modern, just across Woodward, that is much more defined, has, both luxury housing and housing that's affordable for seniors. There is no excuse to make this happen.
And that's coming together quickly over there, too.
Yeah, very quickly. So the thing is, to me, is that I think the pressure needs to be ratcheted up. People need to understand that the Ilitches can't forever hide behind a very wordy statement. They need to come out and talk to us. They are stewards of two of our most important brands.
Yeah.
And when they have issues, if they say that this thing, they were treated unfairly by HBO, then show us the receipts.
I get the sense that the tide is turning a little bit against the Ilitches, I guess, in the sense. Nolan Finley, yesterday, the opinion page editor from the Detroit News, published an opinion piece saying that the city deserves answers from the Ilitches, that, the Ilitches are dropping the ball here and need to, come clean and be honest and transparent with people about what their plans are and what's taking so long. And Nolan Finley, he is no flaming left-wing, anti-development person. He's a dyed-in-the-wool Republican, conservative Republican. What's the saying? If you lose Nolan Finley, you've lost the country? Isn't that what Walter Cronkite said?
Walter Cronkite, I do believe.
One of the big takeaways that I saw, from our friend Matt Friedman, founder, partner in Tanner Friedman, the PR agency, he essentially said on Twitter that, the segment proves that if you won't speak for yourselves, others will speak for you. The Ilitches, again, declined to go on camera or submit to an interview for that segment, as they've repeatedly done. They will not talk about this, which is unconscionable. Like, they, at the minimum, owe people an explanation. What's taking so long? What are your plans? Have your plans changed? If they just answered those basic questions, it would go such a long way. It's not hard. A couple of weeks ago, we told you about the sale of 16 acres at the former Michigan State Fairgrounds site to a development group led by basketball legend Earvin Magic Johnson. Today, the Michigan Land Bank announced that its sale of 142 acres on the Fairgrounds site to the city of Detroit has closed. The total price was $7 million. Mayor Mike Duggan has said he wants to use land at the Fairgrounds site to lure large companies to locate in Detroit. The Magic Plus group, led by Johnson, plans a mixed-use development at 2 separate parcels along Woodward just south of 8 Mile that surround a transit center.
In a major ruling last week, 3 federal judges ruled that the state of Michigan will have to redraw 34 congressional and legislative districts because they unconstitutionally were drawn to favor Republicans. The ruling comes after 61% of voters in Michigan approved Proposal 2 last November. That was the statewide ballot proposal to create an independent commission to draw congressional and legislative districts. Previously, the process was handled by the political party in power in the legislature when the census results come out every 10 years. It also comes as the U.S. Supreme Court is deliberating similar gerrymandering cases out of North Carolina and Maryland.
The ruling means that 15 state House and 10 state Senate districts could be redrawn, plus 9 of the state's 14 congressional districts. The 3-judge panel ruled that the Michigan legislature and Governor Gretchen Whitmer need to redraw the 34 districts by August 1st. But Michigan Republicans are expected to seek a stay of the ruling, citing the ongoing Supreme Court case.
Regardless of what happens with this ruling, last fall's passage of Proposal 2 means that Michigan's legislative and congressional districts will be redrawn by the new independent commission for the 2022 midterm elections. If the ruling stands, it would mean drawing new maps for a special election sometime before that to fill partial terms in the state House and Senate and the U.S. House.
A Detroit native who was one of the nation's longest-serving federal judges and a longtime champion of civil rights and civil liberties has died. Damon J. Keith was 96. A grandson of slaves, Keith was first nominated to a seat on the U.S. District Court in Detroit in 1967 by President Lyndon Johnson. 10 years later, President Jimmy Carter nominated him to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, making him just the 6th African-American in U.S. history to serve on the Federal Court of Appeals. Keith never retired. For more on Keith's life and legacy, Jer spoke with Detroit historian and civil rights author Ken Coleman.
Joining me on the line is the excellent Ken Coleman. We tap him from time to time when we're talking about important things in Detroit and things that have to do with Detroit's history. Ken, welcome to Daily Detroit. If you could, for people, give us a little synopsis of the importance of Judge Keith and his legacy.
Well, first, thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity. Judge Keith, we tend to sometimes use these phrases and terms loosely, but there's no question that Judge Damon Keith was a legend in not only Detroit's history, not only in the field of law, but really in this nation and world. His professional career certainly was carried out in a very interesting era, several eras, really over 50 years, in civil rights and civil liberties.
He has handed down a number of landmark decisions that have impacted people in a real way to this day. Can you talk a little bit about those?
Absolutely. I write for Michigan Advance advanced today, really in the areas of civil liberties and civil rights. He was a lion. Certainly the noted school desegregation case in Pontiac in 1970, which really was sort of a touchstone for the anti-busing movement that took shape here in Michigan and throughout the country. But Judge Keith in 1970 ruled that African-American children in Pontiac and white children in the public school district there had a right to go to school together. And that was something that there was considerable pushback against from some elements of the community in Pontiac. Actually, at one point, even the Ku Klux Klan. So the Pontiac 1970 desegregation case was really important. A couple of years later, in a case involving Detroit Edison, the major utility, Judge Keith ruled in Stamps versus Detroit Edison that African-American employees at Detroit Edison had been racially discriminated against. And in 1973, that was a huge ruling and had ramifications throughout not only Detroit Edison and other utilities, but really in the workplace in general in America. And then really the Keith decision, the 1971 classic decision in U.S. versus John Sinclair, the great poet. Keith ruled that government wiretapping in surveillance cases and domestic security cases was unconstitutional. That case dealt with President Richard Nixon's administration and his attorney general at the time. Those are three large decisions, huge decisions decided by Keith, really in the span of about 4 years.
Well, and his legacy reverberated not just through his decisions, but his contributions to the community in general. I mean, he really was a pillar and a rallying point for a lot of things that happened in Detroit, right?
There's no doubt about it. Keith moves to Detroit as a young child with his family. His father moves the family up from Georgia. And Keith was born in Detroit in 1922 on Independence Day, I like to point out. But Keith very quickly becomes a leader in Detroit, and not just black Detroit, but Detroit in general. Graduates from Northwestern High School in 1939 at a time when the city proper was very segregated in terms of race. And there were really only a few pockets, a few communities where African Americans were allowed to live. Keith grows up on what we call the Old West Side, and where noted African American middle class families lived at the time. He didn't live too far from Berry Gordy, and the John Conyers family lived in that neighborhood. It was a upwardly mobile African American middle class community, and that helped Keith to become a leader. He earns his law degree from Howard University in Washington, earns a master's degree from Wayne State Law School, 1956, and by the 1950s he becomes really a civil rights leader, working with others, whites and blacks, to make sure that African Americans had a fair shake in their opportunity to live the American dream. He becomes a civil rights leader, but also, interestingly enough, in 1961 he helps negotiate a contract for a guy named Willie Horton, who the Detroit Tigers had drafted, and Keith helped negotiate Horton's first major league contract with the Detroit Tigers, and as we all know, that worked out pretty well for Willie.
He really had his hand in so much to do with our city, our region, and in a lot of ways, things that impacted the entire country.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I often like to make the point that Detroit has been so very much a leader in the area of civil rights and the like. And, we've had our challenges in the city proper, but Detroit has certainly over time been recognized as one of the more progressive cities. And people like Judge Keith helped to bring that about. And so it was to no surprise in 1967 when President Lyndon Johnson tapped Judge Keith to sit on the federal bench on the U.S. District Court at a very tenuous time in the civil rights movement, but also, as you know, a very tenuous time in Detroit proper. It was the same year as the Detroit Rebellion.
Well, thank you, Ken, so much for giving us context on all of this. Where can people find you and all the things that you do?
Well, I like to tell people I've got a couple social media handles and one of them is on Twitter at HistoryLivesDET, and also a second Twitter handle where I post a lot of my writing for MichiganAdvance.com, and that is Ken at MIAdvance.
And you're doing this thing with Daily History, aren't you?
Yeah. And so actually, it's supposed to start very soon, but Daily History Nugget on the BlackDetroit.com.
The public visitation for Judge Keith will be from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. Saturday, May 11th at the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History. Funeral service is 10 a.m. Monday, May 13th at Hartford Memorial Baptist Church in Detroit. Interment will be at Roseland Park Cemetery in Berkeley. And with that, I'm Sven Gustafson. If you like what we're doing, tell a friend about Daily Detroit, leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, and become a member at dailydetroit.com/join.
With that, I'm Jer Stays. Take care of each other, and we'll see you around Detroit.
You're listening to the Podcast Detroit Network. Visit www.podcastdetroit.com for more information.